The story of Mittelbau-Dora, sometimes simply called Dora or Dora Mittelbau, is one of the most harrowing and lesser-known chapters of the Second World War. It is a story buried beneath mountains, hidden behind secrecy, and scarred with the suffering of tens of thousands of human beings who were forced into unimaginable conditions. In many discussions of the Holocaust or of Nazi forced labor, attention gravitates toward camps like Auschwitz, Dachau, or Buchenwald. But deep in the Harz Mountains of central Germany, a different kind of nightmare unfolded, one born not only out of ideology, but also industrial desperation. This camp was not primarily a death camp, although death was constant. It was not created for ideological extermination in the same manner as the death factories in occupied Poland. Instead, Mittelbau-Dora was built as a giant forced labor complex dedicated to the production of one of Nazi Germany's most secretive and technologically advanced weapons, the V-2 rocket. The V-2 was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, a terrifying piece of engineering created under the direction of Werner von Braun and deployed by the German military in the final years of the war. It was a weapon Hitler believed could change the course of the conflict. The story begins in 1943. By this time, Allied bombing was devastating German industrial capacity. Factories producing essential war materials were repeatedly struck. One such strike targeted the Peenemünde Army Research Center, the facility where German scientists had been developing the V-2 rocket program. After a major bombing raid by the Royal Air Force in August 1943, the Nazi leadership realized the program needed to be moved underground to protect it. What followed was a rushed and brutal relocation of rocket production into an elaborate system of tunnels in the Kohnstein mountain. These tunnels, originally designed for underground fuel storage, would be expanded drastically. The task of building and later operating this underground factory complex fell not to engineers or civilian workers, but to prisoners, men taken from concentration camps, political prisoners, prisoners of war, and people the Nazi regime had deemed undesirable or disposable. These individuals were transported primarily from Buchenwald, a notorious concentration camp near Weimar, Germany. When they arrived at Dora, they found no barracks, no hygiene facilities, and no place to sleep except the cold tunnels themselves. For the first months of the camp's existence, prisoners lived, worked, and died entirely underground. Imagine the environment. The tunnels were dark, humid, and suffocating. Dust from the drilling and blasting filled the air. Ventilation was poor, and the smell of human waste, sweat, explosives, and machinery mixed into a fog that constantly attacked the lungs. The noise was relentless: jackhammers, explosions, metal grinding, orders being shouted, and the cries of men collapsing from exhaustion. Prisoners worked up to 18 hours a day, digging, hauling equipment, constructing concrete structures, and later assembling complicated rocket components. Death became part of the atmosphere. Prisoners were often too exhausted to move after their shifts. Disease spread easily. Tuberculosis, dysentery, and infections claimed countless lives. Many prisoners later described the sensation of walking past bodies every day, some covered with thin sheets, others left untouched, as if they were simply debris of the construction. The SS guards and Kapos who oversaw them frequently beat workers, punished them for slowing down, or left them behind to die. By early 1944, the underground factory known as Mittelwerk was operational, and production of the V-2 rockets began. However, even after surface-level barracks were eventually built, conditions remained atrocious. Prisoners awoke before dawn, marched into the tunnels, and laboured until their bodies could no longer function. Those who collapsed were beaten or taken away, often never to return. The workforce continually needed replacement, which the SS solved by sending more prisoners from other camps. The entire operation was a contradiction. The Nazis were pushing for one of the most sophisticated technological achievements of the war, yet they relied on slave labourers suffering from starvation, disease, and brutality. Engineers and scientists, including von Braun, visited the site regularly. Their level of involvement and awareness of the suffering around them has been the subject of extensive historical analysis. Many survivors later testified that these scientists and overseers could not possibly have been unaware of the conditions, the bodies, the abuses, the starvation. Yet the work continued, driven by the demands of the war effort and by Nazi ideology. If you're finding this video informative and want more deep historical breakdowns like this, make sure to subscribe, share, and like to help the channel grow. As the production ramped up, the camp system expanded. What began as a satellite of Buchenwald became a sprawling network of more than 40 sub-camps across the region. Prisoners were transported from all over Nazi-occupied Europe. Jews, political prisoners, Soviet POWs, French resistance fighters, Polish civilians, Italian military internees, and others were thrown together in a patchwork of suffering and coercion. The death toll at Mittelbau-Dora is estimated at around 20,000, possibly more depending on the historical source. These victims died from forced labor, starvation, beatings, disease, executions, or from the sheer brutality of the environment. Many did not live long enough to fully understand where they were or what they were building. One of the darkest parts of this history is the moral and psychological complexity surrounding the V-2 rocket itself. On one hand, the V-2 became a symbol of scientific progress, eventually influencing post-war rocket development and even the foundations of space exploration. On the other hand, its production was intimately tied to the suffering of tens of thousands of prisoners. Every rocket launched at London, Antwerp, and other Allied targets carried the invisible weight of human lives. In the final months of the war, the Mittelbau-Dora complex became chaotic. As American forces approached, the SS evacuated prisoners, forcing them on death marches to other camps deeper within German territory. These marches killed thousands more. Those too weak to walk were often shot. The tunnels, once filled with industrial machinery, were partially sabotaged or abandoned. When American troops finally entered the site in April 1945, they found hundreds of bodies, starving survivors, and evidence of atrocities. After the liberation, the story of Mittelbau-Dora became part of the broader narrative of Nazi crimes, but for decades it remained overshadowed by larger camps. The role of certain scientists who later worked in American or Soviet rocket programs caused further controversy. Many survivors carried the trauma throughout their lives, struggling to reconcile how a weapon of technological achievement could have arisen from such devastating human suffering. The post-war world inherited the V-2 not as a symbol of Nazi success, but as a reminder of what forced labor and cruelty can produce under totalitarian regimes. The tunnels of the Harz Mountains stand today as a memorial and museum. Visitors walk the same pathways prisoners once struggled through, now silent, preserved as a warning. The memory serves as both a tribute to the victims and a historical lesson about the cost of science divorced from humanity and about the dangers of political systems built on oppression and coercion. Mittelbau-Dora forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How can advanced engineering coexist with brutal exploitation? What is the responsibility of scientists working under oppressive regimes? How do we honor the memory of those who died in places often hidden from public consciousness? And how do we ensure that such cruelty, industrialized, systematized, normalized, never becomes part of any nation's future? The story of Mittelbau-Dora is not just a story of a camp or a weapon. It is a story of people, tens of thousands whose names were often not recorded, whose lives were cut short by exhaustion, starvation, or violence. It is the story of survivors who bore witness to the darkest parts of humanity, and who, despite their trauma, chose to tell the world what happened beneath the mountain. As the war receded into memory, the survivors of Mittelbau-Dora began the long process of piecing their lives back together. For many, the physical wounds healed slowly, but the psychological scars remained embedded deep in their minds. They carried memories of the tunnels, the darkness, the smell of damp stone and human suffering. Some described vivid nightmares in which they were back underground, hearing the metallic echo of machines or sensing the oppressive weight of the mountain pressing down on them. Others carried guilt for having survived when so many others didn't, guilt for things they were forced to do under the threat of violence, guilt imposed on them by a system designed to strip away dignity and humanity. Yet despite this torment, many survivors made it their mission to document what they had experienced. They gave testimonies, wrote memoirs, shared stories with historians, and spoke to younger generations. Their efforts ensured that Mittelbau-Dora would not simply fade into obscurity, forgotten as just another component of Nazi terror. Because for decades, that was a real possibility. Unlike Auschwitz, Treblinka, or Majdanek, Mittelbau-Dora was not created as a death camp, and its purpose, the production of advanced weaponry, made it less immediately recognizable as a site of systematic murder to the public consciousness. But the death toll, the brutality, and the conditions fully justify its place among the most horrific locations of the war. As historians later discovered, the camp's complexity extended beyond its tunnels and barracks. Mittelbau-Dora was embedded into the Nazi system of forced labor, industrial cooperation, and military ambition. Companies like Mittelwerk GmbH, which operated the underground factory, were intertwined with the SS in ways that blurred the lines between military necessity, economic exploitation, and ideological cruelty. Civilian engineers and overseers often stood just feet away from prisoners who were collapsing from exhaustion, yet the machinery of production kept turning. The forced laborers came from many backgrounds. Some were educated intellectuals arrested for political dissent. Others were teenage boys taken from occupied villages during mass roundups. Many were Jewish prisoners who had already endured other camps before being sent to Dora for labor deemed useful. Others were Soviet prisoners of war who were treated with nearly unparalleled brutality under Nazi racial policies. Language barriers were immense. In a single work detail, one might hear French, Polish, Russian, German, Italian, Czech, Dutch, and more. But the shared suffering became a grim unifying force. Prisoners learned bits of one another's languages, traded small favors, shared stolen scraps of food, and sometimes risked punishment to help the weakest among them. For some, acts of resistance, small or large, became a way to retain a fragment of their humanity. They sabotaged tools, loosened bolts on rocket components, or worked slowly in hopes of disrupting production. Even minor acts of defiance were dangerous. If sabotage was discovered, entire groups could face torture, execution, or retribution. Yet these acts continued throughout the camp's existence. In their own way, they were an assertion that the regime could not fully extinguish the spirit of those it sought to enslave. The V-2 itself, which was central to the camp's purpose, became a symbol of this paradox. It was designed as a miracle weapon, a technological leap that would showcase German ingenuity. When launched, it traveled faster than the speed of sound, descending on its targets without warning. London, Antwerp, and other cities suffered severe damage and civilian deaths as a result of these missile attacks. But every V-2 also represented a cost in human life behind its creation. Survivors later described how they felt a mixture of anger and anguish, knowing that the weapon they were forced to help build would bring suffering to people far away. For them, the V-2 was not just a missile, it was a tombstone for the thousands who died assembling it. By the time Allied forces reached the Harz region, the SS had already begun frantic evacuations. The chaotic death marches that followed were among the most brutal final atrocities of the war. Prisoners were forced to walk for days with almost no food or water, often in freezing conditions. Guards shot those who slowed down. Entire groups vanished in forests, fields, or along the roadside, their bodies discovered only after the war. These marches claimed thousands of additional lives, further compounding the tragedy of the Mittelbau-Dora system. When American soldiers finally entered the camp and tunnels, the scene shocked even those hardened by months of combat. They reported finding skeletal survivors, bodies unburied, equipment abandoned in haste, and evidence of systematic abuse. Photographs and film taken by the liberators later served as documentation in war crime trials. These images, stark and unflinching, forced the world to confront the truth of what had been concealed underground. The immediate aftermath included investigations by the US Army, the British military, and international tribunals. Some SS officials associated with Mittelbau-Dora were prosecuted and convicted. Others vanished or avoided justice in the post-war chaos. A number of engineers and scientists who had worked on the V-2 program were taken into Allied custody, some for interrogation, others for recruitment. This remains one of the most controversial aspects of the camp's legacy. Under Operation Paperclip, many German scientists, including von Braun, were brought to the United States to contribute to missile development and, eventually, the space program. This blurred the moral boundaries of justice. Some survivors and historians argued that the technological achievements of the post-war era were built in part on the suffering in Dora's tunnels. The ethical debates continue even today. Can scientific advancement be divorced from the conditions under which it was achieved? Should the accomplishments of figures like von Braun be celebrated if they were tied, even indirectly, to forced labor and suffering? And how should nations reckon with scientific talent that emerges from morally compromised contexts? Mittelbau-Dora sits at the center of these questions. Decades after the war, the site of the camp began to transform into a place of remembrance. At first, parts of the underground tunnels were sealed or restricted due to safety concerns, but over time, historians, survivors groups, and local organizations pushed for preservation. Gradually, a memorial emerged. Today, visitors can walk through reconstructed barracks, see exhibits containing personal belongings, documents and photographs, and even venture into sections of the tunnels. The silence inside the mountain, once filled with the sounds of machinery and human suffering, now serves as a solemn reminder of what happened there. For those who visit, the experience is often overwhelming. The cold stone walls, the narrow passages, and the sheer scale of the underground complex evoke a sense of claustrophobia and dread. It becomes easier to imagine the conditions prisoners faced, working by dim light, breathing dust and fumes, enduring constant exhaustion. The museum displays tools, uniforms, and handmade items crafted secretly by prisoners. Every object tells a story. A dented bowl becomes evidence of hunger and survival. A prisoner's letter becomes a testament to hope. A fragment of a rocket fin becomes a symbol of the twisted relationship between technological ambition and human cruelty. For Germany, the memorial represents an important act of historical responsibility. It acknowledges the darker chapters of the nation's past and preserves them so that future generations can learn. The goal is not to induce guilt, but to cultivate awareness. Education programs bring students to the site, encourage discussions about ethics, responsibility, and human rights, and explore how societies can slide into oppression when ideology overrides compassion. The story of Mittelbau-Dora is not only about the past, it resonates with contemporary questions about forced labor, authoritarianism, the exploitation of workers, and the moral obligations of scientists and engineers. It warns about the dangers of dehumanization, how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary cruelty when systems encourage conformity or obedience. It reminds us that technological progress is not inherently good. It depends on the values that guide it. As historians continue to study the camp, new details emerge from archives, testimonies, and long-forgotten documents. The full story is still being pieced together. There are still names to identify, stories to tell, and lessons to reflect upon. Survivors, though fewer in number each year, remain powerful voices urging the world not to forget. They often emphasize one message: Remembering is a form of justice. Memory cannot bring back the dead, but it can honor them and prevent the circumstances that led to their suffering from being repeated. In the years following the liberation of Mittelbau-Dora, Germany faced the immense task of rebuilding not only its cities and infrastructure, but also its moral identity. The horrors that had taken place in camps like Dora were initially overwhelming for a devastated population grappling with defeat, occupation, and the collapse of the Nazi regime. In the earliest post-war years, many Germans struggled to confront the depth of crimes committed in their name, and for a time, public awareness of places like Dora remained low. It took decades of survivor testimony, historical research, and international pressure for the full scope of the camp's story to enter mainstream consciousness. One of the complicating factors in understanding Mittelbau-Dora's legacy was the tangled overlap between military necessity, political ideology, and scientific ambition. The V-2 program was not merely a military project. It was a symbol of Nazi aspirations to redefine warfare using advanced technology. For some German officials, the rocket represented a potential turning point in the war, a way to strike Allied cities with unprecedented speed and range. For others, especially those in the SS, it represented a powerful demonstration of German ingenuity. And for the engineers, it represented a scientific challenge, one that many were unwilling to abandon, even when it meant working alongside a system of brutal forced labor. The moral ambiguity of the scientists involved became even more pronounced after the war. When Wernher von Braun and other leading figures in the V-2 program were brought to the United States, their expertise was immediately valued by the US military, which was eager to understand German rocket technology. Von Braun would later become one of the central architects of NASA's space program, contributing to the Saturn V rocket that carried astronauts to the moon. His name today evokes the dual legacy of genius and moral compromise. Many historians have asked, could he truly have been unaware of the suffering in the tunnels? Survivors insist that his visits were frequent and that the conditions were impossible to ignore. The debate continues, reflecting broader questions about the responsibility of individuals working within oppressive systems. The political landscape of the Cold War further complicated the legacy of Dora. Both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to extract as much scientific and technological knowledge from post-war Germany as possible. This competition meant that some individuals who might otherwise have faced prosecution for their involvement in the forced labor system instead found themselves employed by world powers eager for their expertise. This is one of the reasons why the Dora story took so long to gain widespread recognition. Powerful nations had vested interests in what the V-2 program represented, and for years the human cost was overshadowed by technological achievement. But survivors had their own agenda, and they refused to let the world forget. Men who had endured starvation, beatings, disease, and unimaginable cruelty dedicated their lives to bearing witness. They attended memorial events, gave interviews, published memoirs, and educated young people. Their accounts were often painful to tell, revisiting trauma that had shaped their entire lives. Yet they persisted because they understood something fundamental. Memory is fragile, and indifference is dangerous. Through their efforts, a more complete picture of the camp began to emerge. Testimonies detailed the underground conditions with astonishing clarity. The constant dampness that rotted clothing and skin, the stench of illness and unwashed bodies, the hunger so intense it caused hallucinations, the exhaustion that made prisoners collapse mid-shift. Some survivors described the eerie glow of lamps reflecting off metal rocket parts, a haunting contrast to the emaciated figures laboring below. Others spoke of small acts of compassion, whispered words of encouragement, stolen moments of rest, or sharing a piece of bread. These human moments, fleeting and fragile, were resistance in their own right. As historians compiled testimonies, new layers of understanding emerged about the structure of authority within the camp. The SS maintained overarching control, but civilian engineers wielded enormous influence in the tunnels. Kapos, prisoners appointed to supervisory roles, were caught in a morally impossible position, forced to enforce rules to ensure their own survival. Some kapos abused their power, others quietly helped those under them whenever they could. The internal dynamics of the camp were complex, shaped by fear, desperation, and the constant threat of violence. One of the most chilling testimonies came from prisoners assigned to the crematorium or morgue areas. These individuals witnessed firsthand the staggering number of bodies that passed through the camp each week. They saw the toll that labor, malnutrition, and disease inflicted on the human body. Some recalled the haunting stillness of the dead, their faces frozen in expressions of pain or exhaustion. For these prisoners, survival often required emotional numbness, an instinctive detachment from the suffering around them just to stay alive. As time passed, researchers also uncovered detailed documentation kept by the SS and the Mittelwerk Company. These records included work logs, transport lists, engineering notes, and production reports. Cold and clinical in tone, they revealed a bureaucracy that treated prisoners as expendable units of labor. The documents showed how efficiency was prioritized above human life. When a prisoner became too weak to work, he was categorized as unfit and replaced with another. The system operated with industrial precision, reducing suffering to numbers in a ledger. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the Mittelbau-Dora memorial began to take form in a substantial way. Local residents, many of whom had lived near the camp during the war, found themselves wrestling with uncomfortable questions. Some had worked in civilian positions connected to the camp. Others had heard rumors but were afraid to speak. As Germany began a broader process of reckoning with its past, the push for public memorials grew stronger. Historians and survivors played a central role in shaping the site, ensuring that it focused not only on the technology produced there, but also on the human lives consumed by it. The memorial exhibits highlight this duality, the brilliance of the engineering and the brutality of its production. Visitors can see cross-sections of the V-2 rocket, demonstrating the sophistication of the weapon. But these displays are juxtaposed with personal artifacts, tattered clothing, identification tags, photographs, letters smuggled from the camp, and artwork created by prisoners in secret. These items humanize the statistics, reminding viewers that each number represents a life, a family, a story. Walking through the tunnels today, visitors often describe a peculiar atmosphere. There is an almost palpable heaviness in the air, a quiet, somber weight that seems to linger in the stone. Even though the machinery is long gone and the passageways are now safe and electrically lit, the sense of confinement remains. The darkness feels close. The curved ceilings amplify footsteps, echoing off the walls in a way that makes one acutely aware of the mountain overhead. It is a place that compels stillness and reflection. Germany's commitment to remembrance has made the Mittelbau-Dora site an important destination for historical education. Schools throughout the region organize trips to the memorial, ensuring that young people encounter the truth directly rather than through filtered narratives. Guides explain the conditions, walk students through the barracks, and discuss the broader historical context. Survivors, when able, often joined these tours in earlier decades, offering first-hand insights that made a profound impact on those who listened. In a broader sense, Mittelbau-Dora forces modern society to reflect on the ethical responsibilities that accompany scientific progress. In a world increasingly reliant on advanced technology, some of which has potential military applications, the moral lessons of Dora remain deeply relevant. The camp stands as a stark reminder that innovation without humanity can lead to devastating consequences. It reminds engineers, scientists, and leaders that progress must be guided by principles that protect and value human life. Just as importantly, the Dora story speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. Despite facing conditions designed to break them, many prisoners maintained their sense of dignity. They found ways to support each other, to preserve their identities, and to hope for a future beyond the darkness of the tunnels. Their survival, in itself, is a testament to courage. As the decades progressed, the narrative of Mittelbau-Dora continued to expand beyond its physical boundaries, entering academic journals, survivor memoirs, documentaries, and educational curricula. Each retelling added new layers of insight, helping shape our understanding of how a technologically advanced society could descend into such depths of inhumanity. What makes Dora particularly chilling is not only the cruelty of the conditions, but the calculated way in which suffering was integrated into an industrial process. It was not chaos, it was systematized, it was planned, and it was executed through a partnership between military, scientific, and corporate institutions. Long after the war, researchers began uncovering more details about the companies that benefited from the forced labor system. Mittelwerk GmbH, the main operator of the underground rocket factory, had deep ties with larger German industrial concerns. These companies supplied materials, components, and expertise, often aware that the work was being performed by prisoners living under catastrophic conditions. Some managers visited the tunnels, observed the laborers directly, and made decisions that ultimately contributed to the massive death toll. Yet after the war, many of these individuals returned to civilian industries with minimal consequences. The complexity of prosecuting economic collaborators in a devastated post-war Europe meant that only a fraction of those involved faced legal accountability. This lack of justice became a source of deep pain for survivors. In interviews, many expressed resentment that the engineers and executives who oversaw their labor built comfortable lives after the war. They gave speeches, headed companies, joined research institutions, and shaped post-war industry. Meanwhile, survivors struggled with trauma, illness, and poverty. Some were left permanently disabled. Others lost entire families in the Holocaust. The contrast between their suffering and the post-war success of those connected to the V-2 program was a profound moral wound that never fully healed. Another part of Dora's legacy that required years to unravel was the full scope of the camp network. Mittelbau-Dora was not a single camp, but the administrative hub of a vast forced labor system involving more than 40 subcamps scattered across the Harz region. Some were small, housing only a few dozen prisoners forced to work in quarries or build roads. Others were larger, supporting auxiliary infrastructure connected to the rocket production process. Each subcamp had its own culture of brutality, its own hierarchies, and its own grim statistics. But all were part of a coordinated system designed to extract labor at the lowest possible cost, human life being the expendable currency. In the early post-war years, the tunnels themselves became a point of strategic interest. Allied military investigators examined them closely, eager to understand the scope of German technological progress. They removed equipment, blueprints, and other materials. For a time, the site remained under military oversight, but eventually, as the Cold War priorities shifted and memories of the war receded, the tunnels fell into partial disuse. Sections were sealed for safety, and natural decay began to set in. It took a concerted effort from local historians and survivor groups to preserve what remained. They understood that the physical space, the stone walls, the narrow passageways, the remnants of machinery, offered something irreplaceable, an authentic environment where people could confront the reality of forced labor. These advocates argued that without preservation, the site could easily disappear under the pressures of development or neglect. Their efforts succeeded. Today, the preserved tunnels form a central part of the memorial. They stand not as relics of technological triumph, but as monuments to human suffering. Visitors cannot help but feel the weight of history as they descend into the underground complex. The temperature drops noticeably. Moisture clings to the air. The ceilings arch overhead, rough and unadorned. Even with modern lighting, pockets of shadow remain, reminding visitors that the prisoners once lived and worked in near total darkness. As the memorial grew, so did the understanding of the camp's place within the broader context of Nazi oppression. Mittelbau-Dora cannot be separated from the larger machinery of the Holocaust and the war of annihilation Germany pursued in Eastern Europe. The prisoners who arrived were already victims of a vast system of dehumanization. Many had survived ghettos, death marches, earlier camps, or mass roundups. Dora was often the final station in a long chain of torment. It represented the deadly fusion of ideology, economics, and military desperation. Scholars began to frame Dora as a symbol of what happens when human beings become mere instruments in the eyes of a state. The Nazi regime viewed prisoners not as people, but as disposable labor units. Their lives were assigned a value only insofar as they could contribute to the war effort. This mindset is one of the most chilling lessons of the Dora story. When societies begin to categorize human beings based on usefulness, productivity, ethnicity, or ideology, the door opens to atrocities. The survivors who returned to visit the memorial later in life often spoke about the emotional weight of those journeys. Walking through the tunnels triggered memories they had spent decades trying to manage or suppress. Some wept openly. Others found solace in seeing the site preserved, proof that their suffering had not been forgotten. Many brought their children or grandchildren, explaining to them what had happened in the hope that future generations would learn to recognize and resist systems of oppression. The international community also played a role in preserving the Dora memory. French, Dutch, Polish, and Russian organizations contributed artifacts, testimonies, and funding. This international dimension reflects the global impact of the camp, which drew prisoners from across Europe. The memorial's exhibitions now emphasize this diversity, highlighting the many cultures, backgrounds, and personal histories that were destroyed or forever altered by their imprisonment. Mittelbau-Dora's modern educational programs challenge visitors to reflect on moral responsibility. They encourage discussions about complicity, how ordinary people can become involved in extraordinary crimes. The camp did not operate solely through the actions of fanatical SS officers. It required technicians, managers, clerks, guards, engineers, labor supervisors, and civilians. Some were true believers in Nazi ideology. Others were motivated by career ambitions or economic incentives. Still others claimed to be simply following orders. The spectrum of participation demonstrates that atrocities do not require monstrous individuals. They require ordinary people who allow themselves to become part of a destructive system. At the same time, Dora teaches that even in the darkest circumstances, individuals can choose to act with humanity. The small acts of kindness and solidarity among prisoners, sharing food, supporting one another, sabotaging the machinery of oppression, stand as quiet beacons of hope. These gestures did not end the suffering, but they helped some survive and affirmed the fundamental human capacity for compassion. As new generations learn about Mittelbau-Dora, the narrative continues to evolve, but its core message remains constant. The cost of forgetting is too high. History shows that atrocities often begin with small steps: fear, prejudice, dehumanization, and the gradual erosion of moral boundaries. Dora stands as a warning that societies must guard against these dangers vigilantly. As the field of Holocaust and World War II studies matured through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Mittelbau-Dora took on an increasingly prominent place in academic discussions. Researchers recognized that Dora represented a unique intersection of ideology, technology, and forced labor, an intersection that challenged many simplistic narratives about how mass atrocities occur. What happened in the tunnels of the Kohnstein was not solely the result of fanatical hatred, though hatred certainly drove much of Nazi policy. It was also the result of bureaucratic rationality, industrial ambition, and scientific detachment. In this sense, Dora became a case study in how modernity itself, when guided by distorted values, can produce horrors as devastating as any born from primitive brutality. One of the central themes explored by scholars has been the complicity of professionals, engineers, scientists, and administrators who participated in the camp's operations. Unlike in the death camps, where the primary function was extermination, Dora required expertise. It required educated individuals capable of designing, assembling, and testing complex technology. This meant that people with advanced degrees and technical training became integrated into a system built on suffering. Some later claimed that they were apolitical, that they were simply doing their jobs, or that they had no control over the use of forced labor. But historians have shown that many of these individuals had significant influence over how the tunnels were organized, how work was assigned, and how production demands were enforced. This realization contributed to a shift in how society views the responsibilities of professionals during times of dictatorship. Dora forces us to reconsider the notion that science is neutral. It reminds us that knowledge can be used either to uplift humanity or to degrade it, depending on the moral choices of those wielding it. In the decades following the war, this theme would echo in discussions about nuclear weapons, chemical warfare, and other technologies with destructive potential. The shadows of Dora extended far beyond its tunnels. Another important area of research has involved uncovering the identities and stories of individual prisoners. For many years, the victims of Dora were treated as statistics, numbers in a ledger, figures in historical estimates. But as archives opened and survivors shared their memories, historians began piecing together more personal narratives. They learned about the French resistance fighters who were deported after being captured by the Gestapo. They learned about Dutch students rounded up during raids, Polish civilians seized from their towns, and Russian soldiers taken as prisoners of war. They learned about Jewish prisoners who had already endured the horrors of ghettos and extermination camps before being sent to Dora for labor. These stories reveal the extraordinary variety of people who passed through the camp. There were musicians, teachers, tailors, bakers, factory workers, clerks, farmers, and university students. Some had families waiting for them back home. Others were the last surviving members of families destroyed by war. Each person had a life before Dora, dreams, hopes, relationships, talents. All of this humanity was compressed, shattered, or extinguished by the brutal conditions underground. One particularly heartbreaking set of testimonies comes from the Schachtarbeiter, or shaft workers, who were assigned to enlarge the tunnels. This was among the most dangerous labor in the entire camp. These men used primitive tools to chip away at stone, often while standing knee-deep in mud. They faced constant threats of tunnel collapses, falling debris, and explosions. Many were crushed instantly when sections of the mountain gave way. Survivors describe how the screams of the injured would echo through the passageways long after each collapse. Recovery was often impossible. Bodies were sometimes left buried within the walls of the tunnels, entombed forever in the structure that consumed their lives. Another group of prisoners worked in the assembly areas, piecing together the delicate components of the V-2 rockets. Precision was required, even though the workers were malnourished, exhausted, and frequently beaten. Mistakes could result in severe punishment. Despite this, some prisoners used their positions to sabotage production. They made tiny alterations to wiring systems or structural components, subtle enough to avoid detection but significant enough to increase the likelihood of failure during testing or launch. These acts of resistance were dangerous, but they gave some prisoners a sense of agency in a situation designed to strip them of all control. Survivors later reflected on the complex moral terrain of these choices. Sabotage offered a way to strike back against their oppressors, but it also carried the risk of collective punishment. In some instances, when sabotage was discovered, entire groups were executed. Prisoners who witnessed these reprisals carried memories of guilt and grief for the rest of their lives. Yet most expressed that resistance, no matter how small, was essential to maintaining a sense of dignity. As more personal stories emerged, historians began focusing on the psychological experience of living underground for extended periods. The tunnels were not merely workplaces, they were prisons within a prison. The absence of natural light disrupted prisoners' sense of time. Many described feeling as though they lived in a world between life and death, detached from the outside, disconnected from seasons, weather, and the natural rhythms that normally structure human life. The constant darkness and monotony contributed to hallucinations, depression, and sometimes mental breakdowns. When prisoners were finally moved to surface-level barracks later in the camp's existence, some described feeling overwhelmed by the brightness of the sky. Medical conditions in the camp were catastrophic. The camp infirmary, known as the Reviere, was chronically overcrowded and understaffed. Drugs and medical supplies were scarce. Prisoners often arrived at the infirmary suffering from pneumonia, tuberculosis, dysentery, or infected wounds. The SS routinely selected the weakest prisoners for transport to extermination camps or killing sites. Many prisoners dreaded being sent to the Reviere because it often functioned less as a place of healing and more as a waiting room for death. Even so, some prisoner doctors worked with astonishing dedication to save lives whenever possible. These individuals, themselves starving and abused, performed medical procedures with rudimentary tools under impossible conditions. Their courage is one of the most remarkable examples of humanity surviving in a place designed to extinguish it. Post-war investigations revealed another disturbing aspect of Dora: the presence of prisoners who were forced to participate in medical experiments. Although Dora was not primarily a site of medical testing like Dachau or Auschwitz, some experiments related to endurance, infection, and physical strain were performed on prisoners. These experiments, conducted without consent, added another layer of cruelty to the already brutal conditions. In examining the camp today, the memorial does not shy away from these difficult truths. Exhibits detail the structure of the forced labor system, the machinery of oppression, and the human suffering embedded in every part of the rocket production process. Visitors learn not only about the victims, but also about the perpetrators. The memorial includes photographs, records, and testimonies from SS officers, engineers, and civilian supervisors. This transparency is essential. It prevents history from being sanitized. It forces visitors to confront the full complexity of moral responsibility. At the same time, the memorial gives space to honor the victims individually. Walls list names, nationalities, and ages. Display cases hold personal belongings recovered from the site. Some items are heartbreakingly simple: a spoon, a torn shoe, a handwritten note. These objects are reminders that the victims of Dora were not faceless. They were people with stories, families, and identities. As global awareness of human rights grew in the late 20th century, Dora became part of international conversations about forced labor and state violence. Governments, educators, and activists drew parallels between the camp and modern systems of exploitation. While the scale and context differ, the underlying patterns, dehumanization, secrecy, economic incentives, and the abuse of vulnerable populations, remain dangerously relevant. Dora serves as a warning, a historical reference point that shows how quickly a society can descend into moral darkness when ideological fanaticism and economic greed override human compassion. As the story of Mittelbau-Dora spread internationally, more nations began contributing to the memorial effort, not only with funding but with archival materials, survivor testimonies, and historical research. Countries whose citizens had been imprisoned at Dora, France, the Netherlands, Poland, Belgium, the former Soviet republics, and many more, recognized their responsibility to preserve the memory of their citizens whose lives were taken underground. These collaborative efforts helped build a more complete picture of the camp, one that transcended national borders and emphasized Dora's role as a European tragedy, not merely a German atrocity. The process of memorialization was not without conflict. Some former residents of the Harz region resisted the establishment of a large-scale memorial, fearing that it would cast a permanent shadow over their towns. Others, however, welcomed the opportunity to confront the past openly and honestly. Over time, the latter view prevailed. Today, the memorial is considered a model of how to integrate painful history into public consciousness in a way that encourages reflection rather than shame. One of the most significant developments in recent decades has been the preservation and presentation of the camp's original documents. These include transport lists, daily reports, medical records, engineering diagrams, and correspondence between SS officials and civilian engineers. Each document provides a piece of the puzzle. Some reveal staggering levels of cruelty embedded in routine administrative language. Others highlight moments of quiet resistance by prisoners who altered records or concealed information in an attempt to protect their fellow inmates. Together, these documents allow historians to reconstruct not only the physical conditions of the camp, but its internal rhythms, its moments of violent chaos, its patterns of abuse, and its rare flashes of humanity. Survivor testimonies, though deeply personal, often intersect with the archival evidence in striking ways. A prisoner might describe being transported from Buchenwald to Dora on a freezing night in early 1944, packed tightly into a cattle car without food or water. A corresponding transport list in the archives might confirm the date, the number of prisoners, and the grim detail that several individuals died during the journey. These intersections reinforce the accuracy of survivor accounts and highlight the importance of maintaining diverse forms of historical evidence. Not only official documents, but personal memories, photographs, and physical artifacts. As the memorial developed its educational programs, one of its central goals was to convey that Dora was not an aberration created by a handful of sadists. Instead, it emerged from a broader system of beliefs, policies, and economic structures. This is perhaps the most unsettling lesson for visitors, especially younger generations. Dora did not arise from chaos, but from organization. It showed how cruelty can be rationalized, mechanized, and embedded into institutions. To help visitors understand this, the memorial includes exhibits that explore the ideological foundations of Nazi policies, the economic incentives behind forced labor, and the pseudo-scientific racism that underpinned the entire concentration camp system. By presenting Dora within this larger framework, the memorial underscores the danger of reducing its history to a simple narrative of villains and victims. Instead, it examines how societies can gradually normalize dehumanization, and how individuals at all levels, workers, managers, scientists, soldiers, can contribute to a system that destroys lives. Yet despite its heavy themes, the memorial also highlights stories of resilience. Some prisoners used their limited free moments to create small pieces of art, drawings, carvings, or handwritten poems. These creations, made under the constant threat of punishment, served as outlets for expression and reminders of identity. A carved wooden bird might symbolize hope. A secret charcoal drawing might depict a memory of home. These tiny expressions of individuality stand in stark contrast to the mechanized brutality of the camp. Another crucial part of the Dora legacy involves the post-war lives of the survivors who managed to rebuild. Many went on to form families, pursue careers, and contribute to their communities. Their ability to create meaningful lives after enduring such horror is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. But the trauma they carried remained ever present. Survivors spoke of sudden bursts of fear triggered by loud noises, nightmares that transported them back into the tunnels, and long-term health problems resulting from malnutrition and abuse. Some suffered psychological scars that were never fully acknowledged by medical professionals in the years immediately after the war. Public recognition of their suffering came gradually. Governments eventually began offering compensation or pensions to former forced labourers, though these measures often came decades too late and rarely equalled the magnitude of their losses. Even so, survivors used these opportunities to tell their stories, ensuring that their experiences would be documented for posterity. The camp's legacy also extends into scientific and ethical discussions within universities and research institutions around the world. Many engineering programs reference Dora when teaching about professional ethics. The camp serves as a compelling reminder that technical expertise does not exist in a vacuum. Ethical responsibility must be integrated into scientific work. Professors often use Dora as an example to describe how engineers can become complicit in human rights abuses when they detach themselves from the social consequences of their work. In this sense, Dora has become more than a historical site. It is a moral text, a lesson embedded in stone, metal, and memory. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about progress, ambition, and the cost of innovation when divorced from ethical grounding. At the site today, a particularly powerful experience comes at the end of the tunnel tour. After walking through dimly lit corridors, visitors eventually emerge into daylight. The transition is jarring, almost symbolic. The brightness of the sky feels overwhelming after the oppressive darkness of the mountain. Many visitors describe feeling a deep sense of relief, and then guilt as they realize that the prisoners working underground were denied even this simple moment of light for weeks or months at a time. The act of stepping into daylight becomes a reminder of privilege, freedom, and the basic conditions of life that were stolen from thousands. One of the most moving features of the memorial is the annual commemoration held in honor of the victims. Representatives from multiple countries gather to lay wreaths, read names, and light candles. Survivors, when able, speak at these ceremonies, often reflecting not on hatred or revenge, but on the importance of compassion and vigilance. Their testimonies emphasize unity, humanity, and the hope that the world can learn from the suffering they endured. As the number of living survivors dwindles, the burden of preserving memory falls increasingly on educators, historians, and younger generations. Digital archives, video testimonies, and virtual tours help ensure that Dora's story will continue to be accessible long after direct witnesses have passed away. These efforts are crucial, for memory fades quickly without active preservation. Mittelbau-Dora's place in public consciousness today is larger than ever before. It stands as a testament to the dangers of totalitarianism, the consequences of unchecked technological ambition, and the resilience of the human spirit. It teaches that history is not merely a series of events, but a series of choices made by individuals and societies. And it warns that even the most advanced or educated societies can descend into inhumanity when ideology and power override empathy. Today, the tunnels of Mittelbau-Dora are quiet. The machinery is gone, the smoke has cleared, and the echoes of suffering have faded into the stillness of stone. But the silence is not empty. It carries the weight of memory, of tens of thousands of men who were dragged underground, stripped of their humanity, and forced to build a weapon they would never control. It carries the stories of those who survived, who rebuilt their lives while carrying wounds no one could see. And it carries the warning that the atrocities committed here were not inevitable. They were the result of choices, of ideologies left unchecked, of ambition divorced from morality. Mittelbau-Dora reminds us that the past is not a distant country. It is a mirror. The same forces that created the tunnels, dehumanization, blind obedience, fear, and technological hubris, can reappear in any society that forgets the value of human dignity. That is why the memory of Dora must not be allowed to fade into the shadows. It must be taught, studied, and confronted, even when uncomfortable, especially when uncomfortable. The survivors of Dora often said that remembering is a form of justice. By telling their stories, by walking the tunnels, by learning the names of those who never walked back out, we honor their resilience. We show that their suffering was not in vain. We recognize that progress built on cruelty is not progress at all, and that the true measure of a society lies not in its machines, but in its humanity. As we step back into the light, away from the darkness of the mountain, we carry with us the responsibility to prevent such horrors from ever happening again. Let the story of Mittelbau-Dora stand as a solemn reminder of where hatred and indifference can lead, and as a call to protect the values of compassion, dignity, and human rights wherever they are threatened. Thank you for watching and for helping keep this history alive. By remembering it, we honor those who never had the chance to tell their story. If you found this video meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps more people hear and remember these stories.